Okay, so I think it's time to start the second talk. It's my pleasure to introduce Jade Fletcher, who's going to be talking about Lewis's philosophy of language. Take it away, Jade.
Okay, thank you. It's really nice to be here. Okay, so in this talk I'm going to try and motivate, is that really loud? Okay, I'm going to try and motivate two claims. The first one is that Lewis offers two distinct kind of metasemantic stories about how meaning is fixed, right? So the first thing I want to get us on board with is that there's two metasemantic projects here, and that they're both important, right? And I think they're independent of each other in a sense. So if you want to do one of them, you don't have to do the other one. But when we're thinking about Lewis, it's important to understand that these two metasemantic stories, there's a kind of a dependency between them, and one's actually dependent on the other. So that's what I'm going to try and convince you of in the next 20 minutes. So the plan is I'm going to introduce what those metasemantic stories are. So one of them is kind of radical interpretation, the other one's philosophical analysis. And then I'm going to try and say something about the relationship between them, and then hopefully we can all have a nice chat. Okay, so this was kind of talked about a little bit about yesterday, and it seemed that people were much more kind of concerned with the formal aspects of kind of Lewis's thought. That's not going to be what I'm as worried about today. But just to get the kind of picture on the board, literally and metaphorically. So Lewis's conception of natural language is a conventional practice governed by norms of assertability, which allow for successful interpretation and communication between truthful and trusting partners. So there's a kind of two-tier account here that comes out really clearly in the beginning of general semantics, and then depending on which kind of project you're interested in, one of those projects kind of gets taken up in like scorekeeping in a language game, and languages and language. I looked it up, it's that way round. And then in general semantics, you kind of get the kind of exposition of the more formal projects. So one of them is kind of concerned with providing an abstract description of the workings of possible languages, which kind of gives the idea of language as a semantic and syntactic system where items of a language get to be associated with things in the world. And then the other one is concerned with a kind of psychological, sociological, or like worldly facts that underpin how a particular population kind of uses one of these abstract systems, right? So we've got this one project where we're describing something very abstract, and at that point we're not going to be talking about what we do as kind of communities of language speakers. But then the other project is working out, well, okay, so now that we've got this kind of formal abstract description of the kind of syntactic and semantic structure of a language, well, now when we want to give a theory of natural language, how is it that a particular population takes one of these things up to communicate with one another? Okay, so given that, first metasemantic story. Okay, so I've said that the semantic theory needs to be appropriately constrained by considerations to do with language use, interpretation, and communication. I think that this is really important and really can't be emphasized enough. Like, I pulled out a nice quote. I should have brought my extended mind down here with me so I could have read it out. But from Probabilities of Conditionals and Conditional Probability, where he's really, really driving home this thought that if you're in the business of giving a semantic theory, you were really, really worried about what it is that people are doing when they're using a language, right? So as a kind of main constraint on giving an acceptable semantics for a natural language, like the one that we speak, the main constraint on that is going to be kind of getting the right data about what it is when we're interacting with each other. Okay, but the metasemantic story here is Lewis's project of radical interpretation, which is kind of his foundational account of the semantic content of beliefs and sentences. According to this project, the content of beliefs is whatever it has to be in order to rationalize an agent's actions given their evidence. So we start out with a complete physical description of Carl. I mean, it's important to note, I think, that in the radical interpretation, in the main paper, he's kind of relativizing talk of an interpretation of a language to an agent. He kind of corrects this in the postscript and wants to talk about a community. I think Ed's going to be talking about that a little bit later, so I'll leave that, no spoilers. Except just to note that what I'm going to be doing now is talking about it in the kind of I guess what you might think is like the canonical form in radical interpretation. Okay, so we've got this complete physical description of Carl, and now what we want to do is we want to work out what he believes, okay? And so there's two constraints on how we're going to work out what he believes. we are going to think, well, if we were in the position that Carl was in, given our evidence, right, what would we believe? So that's our kind of charity constraint, right? And then we've got a rationalizing constraint, right? So we want to make Carl's beliefs rational. And so you could, if you wanted to put it in the kind of locution that we should sort of expect Carl to be maximizing utility or something like that. So with those two constraints in hand, the thought is that we can kind of assign content to Carl's beliefs. Okay, so that's the first thing, but I'm talking about giving meaning to sentences. So how do we go from the beliefs to the sentences? Well, then we have two further constraints, right? One of them is generativity. And the thought there is that, like, however it is we're specifying truth conditions for the sentences, this needs to be kind of uniform and stateable and probably done in the kind of a tasky T-schema style. And the other one is, guys, what's the other one? It's gone. Yeah, no, it's gone. I really should have brought my iPad down. I'm sorry. Ask me in Q&A. So we've got the beliefs. We work out the meaning of the sentences. And so what radical interpretation is doing is it's saying, well, look, let's imagine I'm Carl. I'm wandering around. Noises are coming out of my mouth. Well, how is it that we're going to determine what those noises mean, right? Like, if you understand what I'm saying, you kind of know the truth conditions for what I'm saying. Well, how is it that we're going to give those truth conditions? And this is the story that we give in this respect. So this is one metasemantic project. Here's another one, philosophical analysis. So a semantic analysis for a particular term or expression gives the meaning for that term or expression. Just to be clear about this, I'm using the terms, I mean, you might think that semantic analysis is a little bit vague. One of the reasons that I'm saying that is I want to make it clear that this is a semantic type of thing. So I think some of the secondary literature on Lewis, when it talks about analysis, takes this to be a kind of like metaphysical reduction or something like that. Now, semantic analysis may help kind of facilitate metaphysical reduction, right? It might help us, maybe we think we need to be committed to something like pain, but it turns out after we've semantically analyzed, we actually only need to be committed to C fibers firing. It might also help us reduce the number of kind of ideological primitives in the theory. So you might think it might facilitate metaphysical reduction in that sense. But I think what's really important here is that there's a distinct stage in the project for Lewis, right? You've got this first thing, which I'm calling semantic analysis, which is about giving the meaning of terms and expressions. And then that's going to be importantly connected to whatever metaphysical projects he's engaged in. But the analysis portion is squarely in the domain of the semantic. Okay, so as I said, he thinks that the best handle we have on meaning, of giving the meaning of an expression, is via its truth conditions. So the type of truth conditions that Lewis thinks should be given by analysis are world-invariant truth conditions. Now, I think the motivation for this is kind of metaphysical, right? It's kind of placing a restriction on the kinds of truth conditions that are going to be successful. So in places he talks like giving a definition and giving an analysis are the same thing. I think for most purposes that's fine, but to give a successful analysis, it's not sort of sufficient to just fix the reference of a term at the actual world. In order to be giving the kind of truth conditions we need to be giving when we're doing analysis, they need to be world-invariant ones. So world-invariant truth conditions provide a uniform type of condition that applies at each world, and then a sentence is true at a world if and only if it satisfies that condition. And so, you can sort of diffuse certain kinds of problems if you approach things in this way. Is that all I want to say about that? Oh, yeah, so here's the kind of the functionalist meaning type thing. So we're giving these definitions that specify world-invariant truth conditions. In many cases, when the kind of subject matter is contingent, he's going to be giving implicit definitions. There's a kind of noticeable exception to that, which is the modality case, which he explicitly defines, again, for kind of metaphysical reasons, because we want to be able to like completely eliminate that talk. That can't be appearing in the fundamental metaphysical theory. Otherwise, Quine would cry. Okay, so one of the primary constraints on philosophical analysis is that it needs to systematize common opinion, right? So Lewis tells us that it's our job as theorizers to systematize the mass of common opinion into some kind of coherent picture. A metaphysician's analysis of mind is an attempt at systematizing our opinions about mind. just to be clear here, so the metaphysician's analysis, I spent like the first year of my PhD crying over that expression. I think what this means is not like the sort of a sort of special species of analysis, right? It's the type of analysis that metaphysicians should be interested in, right? So I think it's not the case that there's this like big thing that's analysis and then there's different kind of species of it, right? Like you can have like semantic analysis, or you can have metaphysical analysis. Like analysis just is a semantic project. But then when you're directing your attention at kind of the metaphysical enterprise, there are particular kinds of analyses in which you're going to be interested in. So we're systematizing common opinion. Doing that is not going to be sufficient for providing an adequate analysis, right? There's going to be other kinds of considerations. So I think one place where sort of a tension between common opinion and other stuff comes out is in naming the colors, where he's like, whatever our theory of color is, it needs to be commonsensical and it needs to be materialistic. And if one of these things needs to go, well, then common opinion's going to go because materialism is like really where it's at. So this does kind of compete with some other constraints, but sort of across the, I mean, this has been said quite a few times, I think, so far, that he like really respects what the folk think. And I think part of the thought there is that we're just, it's in Reduction of Mind where he says, we basically lose anything that looks like analytic philosophy if we give up on the project of analysis. And we lose our subject matter if that analysis isn't going to be kind of constrained by the ordinary things that the folk think when they're going around thinking things as folk want to do. Okay, so for Lewis, common opinion refers to those beliefs or statements which we collectively take to be true as language users. So I think he most often uses common opinion. Sometimes he says common sense, and then he says, well, I don't really like the term common sense because it carries like too much theoretical baggage. Sometimes he says pre-theoretic beliefs. I don't think pre-theoretic is quite right. I think it should be understood as pre-philosophical, right? So the sort of the belief that there's more like atoms in Mount Vesuvius than there is in my lovely chili bottle. I mean, that's not a totally pre-theoretic belief. But the point is that it's pre-philosophical, right? It's sufficiently kind of well known amongst us that if we wanted to be in the business of sort of defining the theoretical term atom, that would be maybe some of the sort of analysis eligible data that we'd be using. Okay, so both projects, both the sort of the philosophical analysis project and the radical interpretation project, are in the business of giving the meaning of expressions of natural language, yet they seem importantly different, right? There's kind of different sets of constraints. When we're doing the radical interpretation thing, we're thinking about rationalization and charity. When we're doing the philosophical analysis project, we're thinking about sort of accommodating common opinion and how analysis is going to ultimately be in the service of this kind of metaphysical project. So what's going on here? It's a genuine question. It's your turn to speak. No. So I think that these projects can support each other. I think it's really interesting that Lewis doesn't offer a kind of explicit comment on exactly how they're supposed to interact. But I think if you take a sufficiently broad look at like the whole of his corpus, and so when he's doing philosophical analysis, whether he's doing it about causation or probability or objective chance or mind or modality or like whatever it is, I think you can see how the output from the radical interpretation project is playing a role as the common opinion that kind of signifies the analysandum that we're interested when we're doing philosophical analysis. So the thought is this. So radical interpretation is the means by which we determine the content of an agent's beliefs and sentences. Semantic analysis is the means by which we give definitions with world-invariant truth conditions of the concepts in which we are interested. And the data required for semantic analysis are the commonly held beliefs of a linguistic community. So it's the output from the radical interpretation project, not any old stuff, right? You might rationalize and assign a belief content that's like super wacky, and maybe it's sort of too contingent, right? So when I'm analyzing sort of red, I'm not going to be building into my analysis that post boxes are red, because that's like an idiosyncratic thing about England. But at the very least, there's going to be sort of a solid set of outputs from the radical interpretation project that are then going to act as the data for the analysis. So a toy example. So let's imagine we tell a rationalization story. Oh, okay. So the last time I touched this material, it was the World Cup. So in the paper version, all of the examples about the English football team. So here we go. Sterling believes that Kane is in pain. Further, Sterling believes that Kane is likely to cry, is recoiling because he's in pain, right? So we're looking at, who are we looking at? We're looking at Sterling, and we've got a complete physical description of him. We're looking at how he's interacting with his environment. When he goes over and sort of, pats Kane on the back or sort of offers him some solidarity or something like that, we sort of interpret that as, well, he thinks that something's wrong here. And so imagine that we do this again and again and again, and we find out that it seems to be the case that when people form beliefs about pain, they form all these other kind of adjacent beliefs about recoiling from it or about being likely to cry or whatever it is. So now let's imagine that we want to semantically analyze the mental state term pain. To begin, we need to elicit and systematize all of these pre-philosophical common beliefs to form the folk theory of pain. And we are then in a position to specify the functional role. So functional role is like I take it as like the genus, the species that we're interested in when we're talking about pain, is the kind of causal role that it plays. We're then in a position to specify the causal role that pain plays with respect to the other adjacent concepts and assign world-invariant truth conditions to the pain-involving sentences. So I think something that I think is kind of interesting. So a couple of people in the secondary literature have talked about, like when they're talking about kind of Lewisian Canberra planning, they say there's like a two-tier approach. There's like kind of analytic functionalism, and then there's this kind of project that's continuous with natural science where we're going out into the world and we're trying to find worldly satisfiers for the truth conditions. I think it's helpful to actually see it as a three-stage project. So you've got a kind of radical interpretation project, and then you've got a philosophical analysis project. And I think one of the benefits of that is it helps us understand why we proceed truth theoretically when we're analyzing the expressions, when we're doing philosophical analysis, right? Because you could just specify conditions. Why do they need to be truth conditions? I think the reason that they need to be truth conditions is because the giving an analysis is going to be importantly connected to the T sentences that come out of the radical interpretation project. I think that's all I want to say. So thank you.